All right. So today we're going to do chapter 5. I'm not going to do the whole chapter. I want to talk about the part that starts around 118, 119. Okay. And let me check here. So there's one piece under the working class that is kind of important I want to mention. Then I'm going to move on to the next segment. And one of the things that they point out under the working class is the blurring of traditional occupational categories. That's page 119. This is actually kind of interesting, and you'll know this. You already know this. You just don't know you know this. So if we go back, I don't know, 75, 100 years, the whole idea behind a blue collar and a white collar job is a white collar job is a job that you get to is a job where you get to stay clean. Essentially, if you don't get to clean your clothes every single time you wear them, then a job where you can stay keep your collars white. Shut up, cat. A job where you can keep your collars white and clean is a good job. All right, stupid cat, hold on. Where's pause? And a blue-collar job is one where you sweat. All right, so a blue-collar job is a job where you sweat, work, and get dirty, and a white-collar job is one where you don't sweat. Still work, but you're not getting dirty. You could call it an inside job versus an outside job. It definitely is caught in the old-fashioned terminology of labor. And if we go back to, let's say the turn of the last century, if you've got even a bank teller job, a bank clerk, you're indoors, you're white collar, you're staying clean. Everyone else is outdoors working and sweating. Or you're in a laundry working and sweating. Okay, so that's the blue-collar, white-collar difference. And one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years, and most of today's discussion is going to focus on that, but one of the things that's happened in the last 30 years is that that distinction is kind of gone. There are plenty of get dirty trades jobs, which, because they're fairly rare, make good money. And there are also plenty of white collar jobs where you don't sweat, dig in the dirt, and get messy, where you don't make much money at all, right? So a lot of the middle class white collar jobs have been squeezed down. An example of this, if you think of just about any place retail, and there are elements of this even at the college where we're working at right now. Retail right now, if you go to a Walmart, for instance, most of the people you're going to meet, maybe a Kroger, are going to be part-time employees. They're not 40 hours, because if they had 40 hours, you'd have to pay them benefits. They're 20 hours a week, 4-hour shifts, 5-hour shifts at a time, and they don't get paid very much money, even though they're indoor jobs. Clerking at the Kroger. What's funny is Kroger actually wears blue shirts, don't they? But we don't care. If they're indoors and they're clerking at Kroger, they're not outside sweating and suffering, but their jobs are paid very, very low. If you're lucky enough, quote unquote, lucky enough to be management, that's kind of a different problem, because in management, there are no overtime rules in management. So people who are managers very typically will work far more than 40 hours a week, 50 or 60, depending upon the place that they're actually working. Now, this is different from quite some time ago, when everybody in the store except for maybe one or two, would have been full-time, getting benefits, and the working people in the store, the clerks, the cashiers, the booksellers, the shelf stockers, whatever you want, whoever we're talking about, they would have all been full-time, they would have had benefits, but they still would have been labor, and there would have been overtime rules. And the management would have truly been management. What's ended up happening is a lot of people are called managers, and you effectively start eliminating the full-time jobs below you and even some of the part-time jobs below you. So the managers end up doing all of this work and having to do it at more than full-time, right? So that's part of that blurring between traditional occupational categories. Just because someone has a blue-collar job doesn't mean that they don't make a ton of money. And just because someone has a white-collar job or a management job doesn't mean they make much money at all. There are plenty of tradesmen and women who are doing very well for themselves, even though they have traditionally blue-collar jobs. And there are lots and lots and lots of white-collar jobs that don't pay squat. Folks could work those jobs and actually qualify as the working poor. Okay, so there's that. Now here's our slide for today. We have one. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, crap. I won't talk too long. Okay, so part of what's been going on, if you look at this slide here, they're talking about the classes in the middle. We already talked a little bit about these divisions before. There's the Great Depression. Everyone was broke. The post-war years, the 40s, all the way through, let's say, the late 60s, when people were doing pretty well. Some call it the American high. There was at least a perception of widespread prosperity, and then everything starts changing by the time we get to 1973. Okay, so we're still talking about those same periods. So when we talk about economic restructuring in the middle classes here, we're actually really talking about post-1973. So the first thing that I want to mention is the technological changes here. Now, if you start to think about it, just about every industry has been touched by technological changes. You have a few of them here, but out in Philly and then down in Florida, there's this restaurant chain called Wawa, and all their registers are programmed to make Star Wars noises when you check something out. Pew, pew. But the thing about Wawa is it's a convenience store, but it also sells like fast food. So you walk in, but when you want to order fast food, you don't actually talk to anybody. You have a little touchpad, and you touch what you want, and you add on the options, and then it sends a thing, and the people in back make it. You run up front, pay for it, bring your stamped receipt back, and the chefs will give you your food. Wawa chefs. They'll give you your food. So it's like a McDonald's or a Subway, except there's no counter people. There are no counter people. Why? Because that touchpad makes fewer mistakes, and you don't have to pay someone to do it. So if those touchpad tellers start taking over, then you're going to need fewer people actually manning or womanning the cash registers at all of the fast food places. Okay. Nowadays, if I want to get money out of the bank, I don't actually go to the bank. I go to an ATM. There was a time when I actually needed to go talk to a teller to get the clerk. The ATM has replaced the clerk, so there's another job gone. When I was a kid, it's kind of hard to imagine, but when you called someone on the phone with the cord to the wall, and you called a business, there was actually someone that answered the phone. They said, "Hello, this is Commercial Federal Savings and Loan." Nowadays, of course, you get a computer. "Hello, welcome to Commercial Federal Savings and Loan. Please dial 1 for English," right? Man, I hate those things. But those people, those jobs don't exist anymore because the machine does those jobs. Similarly, in manufacturing, you've had a whole rash of machines doing the kind of work that people used to do, and the machines are just better, they're faster, they're more precise, and they're cheaper. So people don't make cars anymore. Detroit doesn't employ humans. Detroit employs robots. Some humans have to take care of the robots, but not nearly as many humans as you used to actually need to make cars. We're doing this whole class online. You cannot make computers with humans. They have to almost be built by machines, because you can't have dust contamination. You can't have it all has to be very precise. So the machines take care of it. We're in the middle of we all are familiar with Google and their driving car experiments. It's very cool stuff. Should cut down on car crashes. Should make everyone safer. It also has the potential to put millions of people out of work. How many people drive cab, drive delivery vehicles? How many people drive truck? As a matter of fact, I think Nevada has just allowed for the first semi-autonomous tractor-trailer to go on the road. At this point, they still have drivers. The driver gets it going, gets onto the freeway, puts it into cruise control, thing puts itself on autopilot. Driver reads a book, and then when the truck starts to get scared, the tractor starts to get overwhelmed, it says, please resume, and the driver starts driving it again. Those are all technological changes, and those changes could push people out of an industry. There's so many of these. It's I think you guys understand it. It's happening in publishing. It's happening in music. It's happening in every industry. And all of these people's jobs are going away. And what do we replace them with? Well, that's a good question, right? Okay, so that's technological changes. When those jobs are gone, the people that had those jobs have to find something else to do. All right, the next one, and there's a kind of a free market argument to that. I don't want to take too big of a diversion here, but the free market argument is that as some jobs are displaced, the growth of the new industries that are doing that displacement and the new prosperity that these new industries allow offer more jobs, right? So if autonomous trucks can take over shipping, then that's bad for people who are contemporary truck drivers. But those contemporary truck drivers, if they get laid off, can learn to code and run help work on the software that runs the trucks, or help maintain the trucks. There's new jobs popping up where the old jobs were laid off. That's the free market argument. So not everybody complains or is worried about technological changes in the same ways. But if you want to understand the changes in the middle class economy over the last 40 years, recognizing that many people have been put out of work by technology is significant to that. So the second one, globalization. Now I think you guys probably understand most everything to go along with globalization, but I'll run through it fairly quickly. So again, since the 70s, now there was always international trade, there was always international communication. But if you consider what computers have allowed in terms of data transfer and communication, we live in a different world. It used to actually cost money for me to call from Indiana to Nebraska because that was the phone system we had. And in that world, it's going to be a little bit difficult to do business across time zones when every single phone call is going to cost you $5. In today's world, we use these things, and while they're plenty expensive, it doesn't matter if I call Nevada or Nebraska or Maine. Anyone I talk to is available anywhere in the country. And if I had a business plan and wanted to pay the right rate, I could call really any place in the world. Not only that, we can use voice over internet protocol and email to send really basically anything. So instead of worrying about what kind of cell plan I have, I can bop onto Skype right? And we can be talking for free. Once that communication becomes almost free, there's no reason to not talk to each other. Furthermore, things like plans, presentations, anything that's prepared initially on the computer, you just send it through the computer. Well, why does this matter? Because this communication allows us to do business at a global level that in the past just wasn't possible. Okay. Is there anything else in here that needs to be? There's one point that the book makes that, and this is kind of an interesting theoretical point. But in today's world, an American company really doesn't need to manufacture anything. Let's see, what's a good example? So it's kind of a guy example, but whatever. You're just gonna have to roll with me. Buck used to make pocket knives. They still make pocket knives, and every outdoorsman has a buck fixed blade, a buck hunting blade, or a buck pocket knife. What used to make those knives awesome was that they were made in the buck factory by the family that owned the company, and they were made to a certain specification. Okay. I don't know when they actually went to offshoring, but most of their knives are made elsewhere in the world nowadays. All they have to do is send the specs to the company that they're subcontracting with. Now, in subcontracting, they, then the company makes the knife and they send it back. They check the prototype. If it matches all their specs, who cares if it was made in Taiwan or if it was made in Indiana, right? Well, one answer is the Indiana employees care, but really they're the only ones, because if the knife meets the standard, it's every bit as good as the one that was made locally, right? Except you can spend less money doing it. Okay, well, here's where this gets a little bit weird and where this gets a little bit theoretical. What makes that knife special then? And what is Buck actually selling? Because if they're not actually making the knife, then they're making the brand. And the knife fits the brand. So that Buck becomes a marketing company and not a knife company, not a manufacturing company. Same thing happens with another good example, Schwinn bikes. Okay, so Schwinn has been around the United States for a very, very long time. The first several bikes I owned were Schwinn's. They used to be made in Chicago all the way into the 80s. And they had a proprietary thing that was called electro weld. And so instead of taking the pipes, the steel tubes that were going to be made into a bike and then welding them individually, they'd put the steel tubes into this jig, complete with, I don't know, whatever the bonding agent was, put it all in, and run an electric current through the thing. And it, instead of having tubes with joints, it welded the whole thing into one great big piece of steel. It was a hallmark of their manufacturing process. They were proud of it. It's what made it what it was, right? So Schwinn developed this manufacturing process. This manufacturing process in Chicago built a certain kind of bike. So if you bought a Schwinn bicycle, you were buying a bicycle that had been made in Chicago, that had been manufactured a certain way, right? What made it a Schwinn was how it was manufactured, right? That's what you spent the money on. Schwinn had some very tough times in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and 90s, to the point where it was mostly gone. It's it was almost defunct as a brand. And then one of the department store brands bought it, and I don't remember exactly which one. But so nowadays, when you buy a Schwinn, you don't buy it at a bike shop. You buy it at Dick's or something. That's all fine and dandy. I could be a bike snob, but I won't. But the problem you bump into, not the problem, but the question, the interesting thing is, if one of the department store companies owns the Schwinn name and is essentially just farming out contracts to different bike makers in Taiwan, saying, I want this model in aluminum, this model in steel, this model, nobody makes steel anymore, this model in aluminum, we wanted to have these specs, give us your bid for as cheap as possible. And that company makes it. So then they get their frames and buy their parts from wherever and just slip a Next or a Huffy or a Schwinn sticker on it. What actually makes it a Schwinn, right? Schwinn just becomes a marketing channel. It's not a manufacturing company anymore. It's a marketing channel, right? It's a completely different thing. So then you have to start thinking, I wonder how many of our deeply American companies, the companies that we put our national brand on, right? Because as a boy growing up in the Midwest in the 70s, things like Schwinn and Buck were American, right? But now they're just marketing companies. And who's actually making our toys, right? It's an interesting question. A little bit theoretical, but I think you get the idea. All right, so transnational corporations. Let me say there's a couple of different words for this. A transnational corporation is a corporation that works across a number of nations. So if you have a U.S. company that's headquartered in New York, a finance company, and they also have an office in Toronto and another office in London, that would be transnational. It's an American company, but it has operations in a variety of different locales, nations. But then you also have a multinational company, which I don't think is actually in here. Oh, it's just parentheses, or multinational. And a multinational company, part of what you're trying to get at with the different language is that some companies have a headquarters and a variety of regional offices, but other companies are truly outside of nation states. They operate across so many countries, and they have their main business split across all of them, that they're truly outside of the nation. So the multinational is going to be the one that's it's a little bit backwards from what I just said, but roll with me. The multinational is going to be the one that says, well, we have our headquarters in New York, office in London, office in Toronto, but a transnational, because it's kind of beyond that system, yes, they have offices in New York and London and Toronto and Mexico City and Dubai, and most of their cash holdings are held here. Most of their debt is bought in this nation. Most of their design happens in this nation. Most of their manufacturing happens in that nation. That becomes a transnational company because it just doesn't make sense to say it's an American company at that point. Okay, so these changes have been coming along for, like I said, 30, 40 years now. And Robert Reich was Clinton's economic advisor in the 90s. Okay, so people have been writing about these changes since the early 90s, probably before then. But I actually have one of Reich's books from, I want to say, 92. Anyway, he essentially breaks this new national economic order into a variety of different jobs. There's more to it, but from the job perspective, this is what he's getting at. So the symbolic analysts, right here, the symbolic analysts are the people who work with computers all day long. They design things, they manage things, they tweak things, they tune things, they invent financial things. If it's happening on a computer and it's controlling something out in the real world, that's a symbolic analyst. And it could be anyone from a writer who's writing something and then distributing it out over a blog, and hopefully they make some money, to a finance person who's dreaming up some new CDO they can sell to people, to a manager at Coca-Cola sending specs down to Coke Mexico for cane sugar Coke instead of high fructose Coke. Those are all symbolic analyst kinds of jobs, and those tend to be pretty good jobs. That leaves behind two other sorts of jobs, the routine production workers and the routine personal service workers. All right, so if I buy a Schwinn, and if there's actually Schwinn offices somewhere in the United States, I don't know that there are, but let's pretend there's still a Schwinn in Chicago. If I buy a Schwinn, then I could go to Chicago, I could meet the office, I'm going to meet their salespeople, their design people, their marketing people, but I won't meet anyone who's actually making the bikes. The bikes are made somewhere else. because you still have to have the bikes made in the physical world. Well, that's happening over in Taiwan. So if I want to go find the bikes, I got to go to Taiwan. Now in Taiwan, that's where actual stuff is still being made. Those are the routine production workers here. And those are all the factory jobs that we've lost in the United States, that when people talk about deindustrialization, that's what they're talking about. But you also have routine personal service workers. Now, Reich is doing this a little bit differently than you may have heard in Intro Soc. In Intro Soc, you have extraction, manufacturing, and service. Reich, what he's doing here is extraction is getting rolled into routine production, and service is going to half be symbolic analysts and half be routine personal service workers, right? So a lawyer who makes a couple $100,000 a year is still a service worker. He or she is working that person is helping his or her client with figure out how they're going to do whatever it is they need to do. An orthopedic surgeon, his service worker, right? Hey doc, my knee bothers me. Okay, well, we're going to do this. You could, if you go and get a mani-pedi, right, and someone's painting your nails, that's a service. If you get your back waxed, right, that's a service. Well, if you go to the orthopedic surgeon and he or she scopes your knee, makes it so you can walk again, that's a service, right? Now, the orthopedic surgeon is making enough money that they're probably very well off. But most service, routine personal service, are low-end jobs. I'm not thinking most mani-pedi workers are making more than $10, $12 an hour. The Chick-fil-A cook that's flipping chickens, not making more than $10 or $12 an hour. That's routine personal service. Of course, the lawyer, the ortho, well, we'll stick with those two. The lawyer and the ortho, they're also service jobs, but they're making very good money at the top. All right. So Reich sees these three different separations. And what Reich really wants to do is to make sure that the U.S. has the symbolic analyst jobs. So if that's finance, that's great. It's better for us to have finance than London to have finance. Finance people might be a pain. They might be, aspiring 1%ers, but better those jobs be in the United States than be in London or Singapore, right? We want Apple designing Apple products in Cupertino, California. Might be hard on San Francisco's poor people, but we'd rather those people be here working in our cities, those companies here working in our cities, than taking those jobs and going somewhere else. As soon as Apple or Google or Microsoft decided the economic climate was better, I don't know, in Berlin, and they go to Berlin, as much as we might be frustrated by quote-unquote rich people, if they're taking those jobs to Berlin, that's a loss for the United States. So as long as the globe is separated into roughly these kinds of categories, we want as many of the best jobs in the United States as possible. That's what's best for us. It's what's best for our constituents, our students, our children. And that's kind of Reich's stick. Okay. Now, the decline of labor unions. I mentioned this just a moment ago when I was talking about those blurring of categories from a couple of pages back. And in the decline of labor unions, so coming out of the 40s, and labor unions are one of the things that many people think that mid-century American prosperity was built upon. In likelihood, there were probably a variety of pillars that held up that mid-century prosperity, but for the sake of discussion, let's give them the argument that unions are one of them. So the idea that you should only work 40 hours a week and that you should have a couple of days off on the weekend actually comes from labor organizing and the unions right around the 20s and 30s. Before that, there was no reason not to have people work more, and people did. It wouldn't be uncommon at all to have a 12-hour workday, a 10-hour workday. And it wouldn't be uncommon to have a 6 or even sometimes 7-day work week, right? So the idea that you should have a third of your day for work, a third of your day for sleep, and a third of your day for your family That comes from the marketing of labor way back when, and it was upheld by strikes and such. It was bargained for and built into strikes. Same thing with the weekend. The idea that Sunday and Saturday should be your days to do what you want with very much comes from the labor movement, and labor unions were a part of that. Interestingly, if you're interested at all, go read about labor history, because it was violent, it was bloody, and they had to fight a lot for things that you and I really take for granted. It's actually really interesting history. Okay, well, as I said before, if people aren't working full-time, then maybe they don't need to be in the union, right? If they aren't working full-time, you don't need to give them benefits. So one way to not have to deal with unions is just don't ever hire anybody as high as, beyond a certain level. Number two, this is where that management thing comes in. If someone can be called management instead of labor, then they're not a part of the union. They're actually a part of the administration of the company. And guess what? They're not really for the union. They're supposed to be for the company because they're management. Well, again, when you think about how many people who are managers, who are working crappy jobs for $10 an hour, of course, there are no crappy jobs. We should do every job with dignity, but there are some jobs I want more than others. When you think of how many who are working crappy jobs without a lot of, without much in the way of benefits, without limits on how much they work, you'll recognize that indeed what a manager means today is very different than what manager meant in a world of labor and management. So that nowadays, likely the folks in this class, if they are working full-time, they're not getting 40 hours a week, they're working full-time plus. If they're not working full-time, they're working 10 to 20 hours per job, maybe 30, and they're having to get 2 or 3 different jobs. Well, this is part of that. And let's face it, which of you have the option to not work on a weekend? It's pretty challenging in today's world to not do that. Okay. Economic restructuring. Hold on a sec. All right. Best thing about living in Warner Robins is sonic booms. Okay, so 2 more slides here. So economic restructuring. What the book has is downsizing, outsourcing, and offshoring. Downsizing can be 1 or 2 things, but it always means cutting your workforce for efficiency. On one hand, it's obvious. If you only need 1 person to do what 2 people are doing, better to lay off one of them and only pay for the one, right? If you've got administrative bloat, you should fire some of those administrators, some of those middle managers, and make things much more efficient. That's what downsizing is. Now, downsizing can be a few different things. One, it could just be that there's a more open playing field, right? When the American automakers had to compete against the Japanese automakers in the 80s, one of the things that was really interesting was American auto companies had these huge, so you've got this gigantic workforce, and then you have this huge middle management, who's probably a quarter of Detroit, this huge middle management, and then a handful of execs up here. The Japanese companies weren't like this at all. They still had a huge workforce, but they just eliminated the management and had a small management team up here. Partially, they allowed the workforce to influence management, and partly they were just, it was called flat management. It was just a different way to set up your companies, but it was way cheaper, right? So the Detroit companies might be fine until they have to compete with the Japanese, in which case they got to find a way to make that workforce more efficient. So that's one reason you might downsize. Another reason you might downsize is simply because, as we mentioned before, technological improvement can make your company more efficient. So if you can put in phone trees, phone answering systems, and lay off 100 phone people, then that's great. You just made money by you just saved yourself a lot of money by investing in a phone system. Yeah, so those are two reasons to downsize. And in a competitive marketplace, I mean, it's easy as labor to pick on the companies for downsizing because, you know, it sucks when you get laid off. But in a competitive marketplace, if the American automakers didn't figure out how to make their administration more efficient, the Japanese were going to win. And the Japanese did very well for a very long time. They're still doing very well. Even at home, if your company won't invest in a new system, or if your company says they're not going to invest in a new system because it's important to have these phone ladies on the job, and this company over here says, screw the phone people, we're just going to automate that entire system. Well, if these guys are running a tighter, more efficient ship, these guys are going to end up going under. They have to play that game. So downsizing is not... there you go. Downsizing might seem frustrating if you're the one getting laid off, but it's important in terms of remaining competitive. Okay, so outsourcing is just using cheap labor somewhere else. The way the book talks about it is you can either open a shop and put it somewhere else, like so. Labor costs in New York are high. If I was a financial house, maybe I would want to have some of my computer work, I don't know, whatever, my computer work done in Georgia because labor costs here are low. So I could, you know, Mike's Finance House Inc. in New York could buy some land and build a server farm in Georgia, and that way I only have to pay Georgia computer tax to run the place instead of New York computer tax. That's one computer tax. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to don't actually own this thing, have a Georgia company build a server farm, staff it with the technicians they need, and then just rent the services. Either way you do it, those are both called outsourcing. If you do it here in the States, that's called nearshore outsourcing. If you do it abroad, that's called farshore outsourcing. Because there are significant differences in wage even in the United States. You don't have to go to Thailand or Taiwan, but you may want to. Okay, so I have this word here, arbitraging. It just occurred to me that maybe not everyone knows what that means. An arbitrage is simply, it's a $10 word to mean playing the difference. So if, you guys know this one, if I can get student loans at 2% and I can go buy a 5-year investment at the bank for 5% return, then maybe I'll take $10,000 in student loans at 2%, buy that 5-year I don't know, bond at the bank for 5%, and then when the bond matures, I sell it and pay off my student loans, and I made 3% interest. That difference is an arbitrage. If I have to pay someone $10 to do something in the United States, but I can pay them $5 to do it in Mexico City, and all I have to do is have an internet connection, then I'm arbitraging, right? That cheap labor elsewhere. That's what that is. Okay, so that's outsourcing. In outsourcing, the Taiwanese factory that builds bike frames for every manufacturer out there. That's the other thing is there aren't that many bike manufacturing facilities. So we're buying all these different brand names, and they're just sending the specs to a handful of different factories over there. But so you can outsource the labor. That's what's going on with that. But you can, in today's world, you can also outsource some of the white-collar jobs. And this is a little bit scary if you are in the white-collar world, because you see what it's done to the blue-collar world. So what's an example of this? I once talked with a guy who was developing a sociology textbook, and he explained to me how they went about writing it. They had an author, but what they really did is they took a whole bunch of other sociology textbooks. They took their table of contents and figured out what needed to be in the book based on those tables of contents. They sent, they took copies of the textbooks they bought, they sent them and the new table of contents to Israel. And the Israel, this company in Israel that they hired, had copywriters whose job it was to go through the other textbooks and write in their own words the new copy for the new sociology textbook, right? So if I wanted to write a sociology textbook, I might sit down and write up a sociology textbook. What this guy did is he went and got Israeli copywriters who were cheap, I'm assuming, cheaper than American PhDs, and they just rewrote all the stuff that they had and then sent it back. And the American author went and read through and added some tweaks and whatever it was that he or she wanted to make the book his or her own. I won't say who it is. But that's, you know, it would be nice to think that sociology textbook writing would be the kind of job that I would have open to me. But in fact, no, that has been outsourced. Another company I worked for when I was in market research, well, I didn't work for them. This was some people I knew that did. When you started looking into this other company, their webpage only listed a couple of folks that actually worked for them. And I knew them, which is how I knew this. And what they would do is they would, and they talked about incredibly fast turnaround time on their reviews, on their reports. Well, they'd go and they'd do the interviews. Let's say they'd write, do, 10 hours of interviews on a Monday. And then they'd send it to some Indians. They had contacts in India. And the Indians would listen to the tapes on Tuesday, write up a preliminary report, or overnight, which got sent back, and it was a preliminary report, so it was rough. But at that point, then the American that did the interviews in the first place would start tweaking that report and then send it back, and these guys would fill in whatever needed to be filled in based on the rest of the interview tapes. So you're getting a complete top line, nice report, turnaround in half the time that an American is, because while the Americans here are sleeping, the Indians over there are working. And it was all contracted with this other company, so that the company here at stateside had half as many employees, maybe even fewer, which kept their costs down, right? So you're doing the same thing. You're arbitraging a labor difference. One more thing to say about this. This is, I don't want to say it's good, I don't want to say it's bad, it's just part of what happens in the modern labor force. But this does mean that the world gets to be very, very competitive, especially for middle-class Americans, okay? So if you're an orthopedic surgeon doing people's knees and you're able to make $200,000–300,000 a year, you're going to be okay for the time being, because that's not going to get outsourced. If you're a nursing home attendant whose job it is to help people stay hygienic and clean, change sheets on old people's beds, your job's going to be pretty stable because that needs to be done here. But for everybody else in the middle, we're competing with the globe. I'm not competing with the sociology PhD that's teaching at Mercer. When it comes to textbook writing, I'm competing with a bunch of Israelis that learned sociology off of Wikipedia. Well, their income is going to come up a little bit from their ability to write these things, but my income is also going to go down quite a lot. right? And we've seen this happen in American factories everywhere. I'm sure the American factories might be able to keep some of their jobs here, but at what wage, right? And the wages go down. Meanwhile, if you've been paying attention to manufacturing around the world, low-tech manufacturing, has gone from one Far Eastern country to another and Mexico too, because it's momentarily cheaper to build a factory here and use that for a few years, build a factory here, use that for a few years. But those local factories inevitably raise the standard of living where they're at. You can't even see my other hand. Inevitably raise the standard of living where they're at. And in so doing, if China's factory district is people are starting to make good money, it might make sense to open something in Taiwan. It might make sense to open something in Singapore. And depending upon shipping costs, it might make sense to think about Mexico. Hopefully, if that makes a certain amount of sense. Okay, so demographic factors. These two demographic factors that these guys are talking about. Okay, the two demographic factors that these guys are talking about. One, immigration. Two, women in the workforce. As you can see that. So I'm just reading the PowerPoint. Sorry. So immigration lately has been very, very high. High enough that the book compares it to the wave of 1880s to 1920s. That period of immigration is very important for understanding the modern America we have. And if we've reached a proportionate similarity, then that means that the new America is being shaped by the immigration we're having now. But the thing is that the immigration nowadays means a couple of different things. And unless you're really thinking about it, you're likely not seeing both of them. Okay. On the one hand, we have tremendous immigration of folks who are coming in for low-skilled jobs. Agricultural jobs is a great example. Out in the Midwest, you've got factories that are full of immigrants who didn't really come with any skills, but they're happy to work, and so the slaughterhouses hire them, and the peach orchards hire them. Okay, so those guys are coming here. They're working. Different political parties have different feelings about this. One thing that's man, you could really do a lot on that. So one complaint you'll hear is that a lot of them are working illegally, so it's cash jobs, so that that's artificially lowering the price of labor. If it's cash work, they're not paying into Social Security and income taxes. If they're working and they're illegal, but they're on forged Social Security, then they are actually paying taxes and they are paying in. They'll just never get a shred of any of it back. So that's kind of that's kind of 50-50. On the flip side, most of the guys that you see aren't actually illegal. Most of the folks that are here legally, at least I think they are, and that would actually be worth looking into. But how about this? A significant chunk of them are here working legally, and those are the jobs they have. And in order to economize, they'll put 2 or 3 people in a house. They'll work these jobs, which aren't the most enjoyable jobs ever. But those jobs are better than what their options were back home, and so here they are trying to do those jobs. It's only a problem we have when the economy is good. When the economy starts to shrink and slow down, immigration also starts to shrink and slow down. And I think we're at a little bit of an ebb for the moment because the last few years have been so rough. Now, in our world, they're often Hispanic, but not only. There's also, really anybody from around the globe who wants to come and get those low-skill jobs. They're here. Okay, but then there's also people who are coming in for very high-skilled jobs, which is a little bit frustrating. And some of the jobs that pay very well here in the United States aren't able to be completed by American citizens. So we're bringing in PhDs and we're bringing in science and technicians to do these very high-skilled jobs. Whether that's good for us or not I don't know how you answer that. On the one hand, we don't have to pay for their education. On the other hand, geez, considering our unemployment rate, it might be nice if some Americans could go get the skills for those jobs. But that's, the responsibility of the individuals who did or did not get those skills. So you've got both of these streams of immigrants coming in, but they end up with really different kinds of impacts on the economy, really different kinds of problems and benefits for the communities that they end up in. There's just not, the only thing that they really share in common is that they're all immigrants. My understanding is that even as fast as the U.S. has been growing in the last few years, it's not growing because Native Americans, small n, have been having that many children. It's because the immigration is that high. Our birth rate is the same as all the other mature Western countries, so we're growing because people are immigrating in. Okay, the second one, women in the workforce. This one's a little bit intriguing because we like to think of women in the workforce as a great thing, like, yay, go women, women's equality, women making money. It's a wonderful thing. There's a negative side to all of this too. And I don't know if it's a cause or if it's a result or if it's just a different way of saying the same thing. But you'll notice that women entering the workforce en masse is something that only really started in the early 70s. A quote that I love, I got from Elizabeth Warren, is that in 1971, a woman with a 16-year-old child had less chance of being in the workforce than in 2011 than a woman with a 6-month-old child. Women entered the workforce en masse. Now, what would you expect would happen if 50% of the population decided they were all going to work all of a sudden? You'd expect wages to go down. And in fact, wages have been fairly stagnant since the 70s. When you look at families and family incomes, the only growth over the last 30 years is because women have entered the workforce. So men's jobs and men's contributions to families have stayed about the same, but the women entering has added more money. Not only that, but men's wages, blue-collar wages, have been fairly stable when you adjust for inflation over the last 40 years. So men haven't been making more money. Families have been making more money, and it's because women have entered the workforce. Now, the reason I was waffling earlier is there's a political thing here, but it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. Did women enter the workforce in the numbers they did because the economy was tanking and families needed it, or did the economy stagnate because women entered the workforce? I don't have an answer to that question. I'm sure there are political people who will give you an answer to that question. Take it with a grain of salt on both sides. But you can recognize what's going to happen there. Huge increase in the number of people looking for work. That's going to have a downward pressure on wages. Okay, so let's jump here to the two-income trap. I read the section on new consumerism. Consumerism's consumerism, I don't care. But the two-income trap is sort of an interesting problem. Okay, so in today's world, we want to look at families who are doing well, and we want to accuse them of being materialistic. You got to go out, you got to get a great big McMansion with 2 or 3 really nice cars. You got to be in some fancy suburb with annoyingly good schools, and we sort of hate them. And it's fun to hate them. We can do whole comedy routines on hating them. But again, just like everything else, there's a flip side to that too. In today's world, where your children go to school is entirely dependent upon where you live, right? Unless you are able to afford to send your kids to private school, which, at least up in Macon, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 per child. I don't know about you, but I ain't paying that. Okay, So what's the response? Well, then a family needs to find a home in a decent school district. And when you compare school districts with good schools compared to school districts with bad schools, it's always more expensive to live in the school district with the new schools. In some towns you cross that line and there's a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 difference in homes just because you're able to get the home in the better school district. Okay, so you go get that house. Now, maybe you could have afforded a house in the better, or in the other neighborhood, the other town, with one job, but now here you need 2 jobs. And once you need 2 jobs, you need 2 reliable cars, right? Okay. Immediately, right there, you have a big problem, all right? So if I have to work and my wife has to work for both of us to afford our house, right? So here's me, here's her, here's my income, here's her income, and our house payment is more than either one of us can make. Notice, as soon as one of us loses a job, you have a catastrophe in the making, okay? Whereas if we were both working, but our house could be afforded by one of us, right? So here's us working, but here's our house payment. Then either one of us can lose our job, and we're actually safe. We're more secure than the family who's got one person working and a house payment. So you would think that adding an extra person would make you more secure, but because you have to add an extra person so that you can live in a better school district, then you've actually doubled the risk, because how do I do this? If you imagine a 1950s family with one person working and one person staying home, if the chance that that person is going to lose their job in any given year is 10%, then that family is facing a 10% chance of catastrophe. Okay? If both people are working, but the house payment is smaller than either one of those 2 jobs, then you've actually cut that risk into 5%, because either one can lose their job and they're actually okay. The only way it's really a catastrophe is if they both lose their job. So because you're only looking at, well, and that's actually going to be less than 5%, but who cares? Okay, now, if in fact you've got the same risk of losing their job, but the house payment is larger than both of them working, or larger than each individual income, then there's a 10% chance that either one could lose their job every year, which actually ends up doubling their risk exposure. So the 2-income trap is we're both working, we can afford more, we do afford more, and in so doing, we end up opening ourselves up to greater economic uncertainty. It's actually safer to be a single income with a modest home, safest to be dual income with a very modest home, but dual income with a pleasant home or a nice home, anything but a modest home, is actually the riskiest of all. So you make more money than everybody else until something happens, in which case you have more catastrophe than everyone else. That's the 2-income trap. So I got this from Elizabeth Warren. I'm going to make sure that the video that goes to is in the playlist somewhere. Yes. Okay. All right. Any questions you guys have, send me an email, post it in the discussion, whatever. But we can talk more about this later.